A young mother found dead in a cemetery.
She'd been stabbed 25 times.
The killer saw Cynthia McLuhan as this object to play with by posing her.
It sounds profoundly sick because it is.
For 3 years, police are baffled.
The investigation continues until we find out who's responsible.
It was a total mystery.
Until Sergeant Joe Kenda realizes this case goes much deeper than he'd ever imagined.
And all the experience of all the people in this room have never seen this before. Could this be the rarest of criminals? A savagely evil serial killer. When a case becomes cold, it's the ultimate frustration. You are searching for a shadow, a ghost. But do we surrender? Absolutely not.
It's getting late, and the Uinta Gardens shopping center is looking like a ghost town. The pharmacy is the last store to lock up.
The store was being closed at 9:45 by the manager, Joe, and Herlinda, who was one of the cashiers.
There was snow outside and it was cold.
Is that?
Looks like it.
Cynthia worked the cosmetic counter.
What's she still doing here?
Immediately, this is bad because she checked out 45 minutes before.
The lights were on and the car was running.
Cynthia?
And the windshield had some ice scraped off.
Where is she?
We just thought that was kind of strange. Why would she leave her car just sitting there running?
Cynthia!
Cynthia?
None of it made any sense at all. The worst thing you could possibly think comes to your mind.
Cynthia!
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 Victim is now disconnected.
3 years later, after a long stint in patrol, Sergeant Joe Kenda has recently returned to homicide. But this time, not as a detective.
I returned to homicide as a supervisor. As the boss, you always have feelings about what you'd like to do to improve things, to change things. So I began reviewing unsolved missing persons cases and unsolved homicide cases to be resolved.
Hey, Beverly, I need to schedule a meeting. Can you contact everyone in the field and have them here by 12 o'clock sharp? Thanks. Bye. All right, gentlemen, listen up. You guys have done one hell of a job last year closing cases. But this year, I think we can do a little bit better.
When Kenda took over as a sergeant in the Detective Bureau, we welcomed his involvement. He was smart, well-educated, very charismatic.
I want to revisit some of the cold cases that we let slip through. The question is, which ones do we look at? Now, I've got a few thoughts, but I want to hear your ideas.
With my team of homicide detectives, I wanted some unit cohesion, and I was interested in what they thought about everything. Many heads are better than one.
How about you, Lou? Any ideas?
Detective Lou Smith had an instinct for it, unlike any other.
Well, I didn't work it, but how about Cynthia McLuhan? She went missing in '82.
The Cynthia McLuhan case was one we all really wanted to solve.
All right, let's look at the case file.
Though none of Kenda's detectives up to speed.
Cynthia McLuhan. She was 22 years old when she went missing. Coworkers found her abandoned vehicle in the parking lot where she worked.
No evidence in the car and no witnesses.
Okay, then who'd they talk to first?
The family.
Detectives went to the home of Cynthia's mom.
Oh, thank you.
You're welcome. Which is where Cynthia's living with her daughter, Stacy. And Cynthia's friend, Mary, is there also.
Look, I know this is all very, very shocking, but we need to know more about your daughter if we're going to find her.
Well, Cynthia and Stacy moved in with me recently because money's been a little tight. Cynthia works 2 jobs and I help out and watch Stacy.
Is she aware of what's going on?
No, not really. She keeps asking for her mama, but I don't know what to say. I keep telling her she'll be home soon.
Cynthia did everything she did for her girl, for her daughter. Her relationship with her daughter was something that was never separable.
What we need to find out is if there was anyone in Cynthia.
Would be to determine who does Cynthia associate with. People don't get abducted generally by a stranger.
I don't know.
It was a total mystery. I mean, no idea what had happened. Cynthia really did not have enemies. Can't say that there was really anybody that disliked her.
What about Stacy's father? Where is he?
He and Cynthia were married for a short time, but things didn't work out.
They're curious about someone that had a motive to do her harm. And the first and obvious choice is the ex-husband.
But he lives in Arizona.
Even at the first moment of disappearance, there was never a thought of him doing anything like that.
They talked to him on the phone. He is in Arizona, and he provides an alibi the day she goes missing. He's not part of this.
How about a boyfriend? Was Cynthia seeing anyone that you know of?
Well, recently she's been seeing a guy named Dave.
Dave.
Winfield. Dave Winfield.
And of course, the detectives are immediately interested in David Winfield. Who is he? Did they end their relationship badly?
What do you know about Dave? Is there any issues with him?
I don't know of any issues during the relationship, but I know that Dave was pretty heartbroken when she ended things.
Yeah, that's...
Good job. What letter is this? No, you don't know? Yeah, sure you do. That's a J. I'll get it. Hello?
Hi, it's me. Listen, can we just talk? I love you. If we could just give it another try.
Dave, we've talked about this, okay?
Cynthia.
No,
You don't
Dave.
understand.
I'm sorry, I gotta go.
Wait.
He would do anything to get her back.
There was concern on the mother's part that the ex-boyfriend might have tried to abduct her, to try to force her into accepting their relationship and going back the way it was.
At that point, detectives focused their attention on 34-year-old Dave Winfield as Cynthia's possible abductor.
Detectives did some digging. They found out that Dave secretly spent some time at the hide and seek.
At the time, the Hide and Seek Lounge was the largest homosexual bar between the Mississippi River and the West Coast.
That information certainly put a different perspective on the case.
People know about that.
Right.
In the modern day, homosexuality is universally accepted for the most part. In the 1980s, it was a secret world.
In Colorado Springs, having a gay affair was particularly scandalous. It could hurt you at your job. If you were in the military, it could get you discharged. I mean, the ramifications were huge.
The speculation might have been that Cynthia somehow discovered this, and Dave Winfield was now trying to suppress that information from coming out.
And once Dave found out that we were asking around town about him, he decided to show up at the station.
No kidding.
Did you have anything to do with the disappearance of Cynthia?
I care a lot for Cynthia. I'd never do anything to hurt her.
Did she have any issues with your little trips down to the hide and seek lounge?
What? How do you know about that?
Look, Mr. Winfield, we're not interested in your private life. We're just trying to figure out, perhaps, would that be a pool?
No, okay? Cynthia never knew about that. Even if she did, she wouldn't tell anyone.
So it gives you an insight on Cynthia. She just seemed to be a nice, trustworthy woman.
Did you have an alibi?
Yeah, it checked out.
So Winfield is out. No opportunity.
Okay, so what's next?
It turns out that more evidence surfaced the night that Cynthia disappeared.
Just 2 hours after Cynthia McLuhan vanished from work, a sinister clue was discovered at a nearby motel.
In doing his nightly rounds, a security guard for one of the motels,
What the hell?
came across some clothing outside of one of the motel rooms.
The clothing is just dropped, dumped in a pile. And under the clothing is a purse. There are credit cards, there's some money. And it also contains Cynthia McLuhan's Colorado driver's license.
The motel had no record of Cynthia checking in, and when the items were turned in to police, they quickly caught the...
Was the clothing hers?
They matched the description that she was last seen wearing when she left work. But not all of her clothes have been accounted for.
What do you mean?
Her bra and panties were missing.
The clothing that's missing are intimate apparel, so it suggests there may have been some sexual involvement.
When there's evidence of abduction and sexual assault, the end result is never good.
The room where the clothes were found outside of, did we look into who checked into it?
We did. It turns out that the apartment wasn't rented for 1 week.
And nothing materialized from there. Detectives have been all over the area for weeks and didn't turn up any new leads.
When someone goes missing, the more time that passes by, the more difficult things become. You have no place to go and nowhere to find your victim until they are found by someone.
It was a bone-chilling afternoon, 42 days after Cynthia McLuhan disappeared from her workplace.
A 17-year-old named Robert Stockner was jogging through a cemetery in the west side of Colorado Springs.
Fairview Cemetery. He noticed something looked odd. And in fact, as he got closer,
This is no longer a missing persons case. Somebody took her and killed her. We're investigating the disappearance of 22-year-old Cynthia McLuhan. She has been missing for 42 days when her body has been discovered in Fairview Cemetery.
Because it was so cold outside, her body was well preserved.
In cold temperatures, aside from the whiteness of the skin, they look the same as they did when they were alive.
It was a brutal scene.
I responded to the cemetery. Cynthia's body was covered with blood. She'd been stabbed numerous times. She was completely naked except for her shoes and her socks.
There are definite...
There is rape, there is murder.
Her bra and panties are missing from the pile of clothes at the motel.
Killer probably kept them for himself.
It's often thought that when the killer takes one of the possessions of the victim, that it's a trophy. It can be a source of pride when they remember that they were able to subdue another human being.
How her body's just positioned up like that?
Yeah, that's strange.
She's kind of sitting down but bent forward, a very unnatural position. It's not one that would look comfortable. Out of all the homicides I've worked, I don't remember ever coming across a body position just this way.
Some sexual criminals will pose the remains and stand back and admire them for a period of time. It sounds profoundly sick because it is.
This guy didn't hold anything back, did he?
She had been stabbed 25 times.
Get some photos.
So do you know if the sexual assault happened in the cemetery or was it just a dumping ground?
Well, it's possible. We didn't see any drag marks or any kind of blood trails.
This is a remote cemetery with very little foot traffic, which is precisely why Cynthia's killer brought her. Shows up in that parking lot.
Let go! Shut up!
forcibly puts her in his car, drives to the cemetery, raped her, and immediately killed her in the same spot. And then drove off with her clothing and dumped it in this motel in the central downtown.
Canvas of the area turn up anything?
Sort of. We came across a guy who said he saw a dark-colored pickup truck leave the cemetery a few weeks before. So we looked throughout the neighborhood to see if we could find a similar pickup truck.
One of the people that we find who would own that pickup truck is a Richie Hayden. He lived 2.5 blocks from the Fairview Cemetery.
This guy who said he was at the cemetery, but he was there because of the great view at Pikes Peak. Sounds a little suspicious, but we couldn't find anything that ties him to Cynthia.
There's nothing about him that alarms them. He has an explanation for his behavior.
Okay, then what?
Nothing.
Case went cold.
They believed it was someone connected to her that hated her for whatever reason, but they could never determine that anybody should ever sort of dies.
After the notification of finding Cynthia and still no leads, it just went on for a long time, several years of no information or nothing being said about it. Very, very difficult.
Okay, then. It's time to heat this thing back up.
We all agree that Cynthia McClellan is an innocent victim. No doubt about it. That inspires us.
John, Lou, I want you to take the lead on this one, but we're all gonna be working it with you.
This case had a lot of emotional appeal. Personally, this was one I really wanted to take on.
So the working theory of the case still remains that it's someone she knew. The reason that's true is stranger crimes are rare. They represent less than 5% of all murders.
The first thing we need to do is re-interview the original witnesses and revisit the old leads, starting with the guy with the dark truck. What's his name?
Richie Hayden.
Time has a way of loosening tongues, and every experienced policeman knows it.
All right, let's go.
Record a mile long, and we're looking for...
Hey.
So Anderson is assigned a lead about Richie Hayden.
Man, Richie Hayden has a sexual assault conviction. It's not all. Got his employment history. Take a guess at where he worked as a dishwasher in 1982.
I'll be damned.
Lo and behold, what does he find? During the time of the crime, he worked at the motel where the clothing was discovered. You don't have to be a mathematician to know that 2 + 2 equals 4. So, Mr. Hayden, we need to have an up close and personal with you again. We have reopened the Cynthia McClellan homicide as a cold case. During the course of that work, we have determined an individual who has some very interesting parts to his life that makes him emerge as a suspect.
Kenda and his team would like to speak with 30-year-old Richie Hayden, but he no longer lives by Fairview Cemetery. In fact, he's now on parole in Wyoming.
So you're saying I'm gonna have to send you to Wyoming?
Maybe knew from Cynthia's autopsy that when Cynthia was sexually assaulted, her killer left behind evidence of his own blood type. So we can compare that with the blood type of a potential suspect and eliminate certain people.
The next step in terms of this individual, Mr. Hayden, is to determine what is his blood type.
Why don't you check with the lab and let me know what you find out?
Sure.
So Detective Anderson makes a call to the laboratory and says, what do you know about this guy? Tell me about his blood type. And they tell him that evidence has already been obtained because of the count of sexual assault.
All right, stick out your arm, make a fist.
And as it turns out, his blood type is different than that of the perpetrator of this crime. So despite his truck, despite his criminal record, despite his employment at the hotel, it's not him.
Without a suspect, Kanda and his team begin retracing old steps in hopes of sprouting a new lead.
And one thing we wanted to do was to go back and talk to Cynthia's close friends at the time. One of those was Mary Dodito. She had been at Nancy's house, the mother's house.
Her and Cynthia were best friends.
It was over.
No, ma'am. The investigation continues until we find out who's responsible.
Mary, we're wondering if you might remember anything that you might have forgot to mention when Cynthia first went missing.
Well, there is something I probably should have said a long time ago.
Well, if it's something that might help us find Cynthia's killer, I'm sure she would want us to know.
There was a guy that Cynthia was dating that nobody knew about.
Why was it a secret?
He was married.
He's married? Really? Now that's interesting.
I should have said something sooner. I didn't want to say anything in front of Cynthia's mom, and at that point we were hoping she was still alive.
Mary, it's okay.
You got to keep in mind, this was her good friend, and so I understand why she didn't do it at that point.
So who is this guy?
His name's Steve Carlton. She had a second job, and he worked with her there.
You finding everything okay?
I am, but do you have any socks?
Cynthia and Steve Carlton met because he...
According to Mary, he had told Cynthia that he was getting a divorce. Turned out that wasn't the case.
Cynthia, I'm sorry. All right, I should have told you sooner.
Yeah, you should have, you lying piece of Now I'm the one who looks like the bad guy. Maybe I should just call your wife and see how she feels about all of this.
Don't you dare, Cynthia!
Screw you!
Sometimes married men want to protect their wife from ever finding out. Murder is one way to do it.
Do you know if Steve still works at the same place?
Not that I know of. I haven't seen him in a while. I just know he was in the Army.
Well, you've been very helpful. Thank you for being honest with us. We'll let ourselves out.
After learning of Steve Carlton, investigators reach out to Fort Carson to see if he has shown up on their radar.
Active military have their own police called the CID, which stands for Criminal Investigation Division. They investigate criminal matters involving active duty military.
Sergeant Steve Carlton. Where do I remember that name from? It says in '82 he put in a transfer for South Korea. Be December.
That was shortly after Cynthia's murder. So our question was he trying to distance himself from this murder?
Was his request granted?
No, it was denied due to poor performance on his part. He's been under investigation multiple times.
And what'd he do?
Sexual misconduct.
Turns out this guy is accused of making obscene phone calls to various women on the base. Further, there's been someone going into the ladies' locker rooms on the post and stealing their underwear. And the military police believe it's this guy.
That's bizarre.
Yeah, you could say that.
We're gonna need to speak with Mr. Carlton as soon as possible.
Think I'll make that happen?
Mr. Carlton now emerges. Not only does he have a relationship with our victim, but now we have knowledge that he's potentially involved in sex crimes in the military. That adds up to suspect. So here we have a married man who is dating Cynthia McLuhan. Sexual offenses. So let's go find Mr. Carlton and see what he has to say.
Sergeant Carlton, thanks for coming and talking to us.
What's this about? Cynthia McLuhan.
Cynthia? Did you guys find the guy that killed her?
We were told you were having a relationship with her. Is that true?
Yeah, we did.
Mr. Carlton says they became friends, they began to socialize after work on a few occasions, and then they engaged in an extramarital affair.
But we ended it a few weeks before she went missing.
Whose idea was that?
Mine.
Was Cynthia upset about that?
No. I mean, we both knew what we were doing was wrong.
No.
You think I killed Cynthia?
We didn't say that. But you were having a secret relationship with her. And we were also made aware of some of the questionable things you did in the past.
Like what?
Some inappropriate acts over at Fort Carson.
Oh, that's garbage.
He vehemently denies both of these crimes. I didn't do it. I never called anybody. I've never been in that locker room.
Look, I didn't kill Cynthia. I didn't have any reason to want to harm her. Once when I found out that she was murdered, I didn't know. She was a good person. I swear on my life, I didn't kill Cynthia.
Steve Carlton claimed he really cared for her, that he wouldn't have killed her. He seemed very believable.
All right, you're free to go. For now.
He is just somebody that we thought was interesting, and we've just lost interest in him.
With yet another suspect out of the running, the investigation begins to lose steam.
Where are we now in this case? Why can't we find a legitimate suspect who has a relationship with our victim?
Same dead end we hit 3 years ago.
Kenda wonders, perhaps he's been going about this the wrong way. Instead of focusing on the victim, what about the crime itself?
In this case, think about it. Abduction from a parking lot, rape, extreme knife violence, the way he positioned the body. I mean, it all seems
crime in precisely the same way on every occasion. These are not isolated incidents. These people tend to commit and reoffend all the time. It's what they do. Their appetite increases for the behavior.
Ken, are you saying you think this is a serial killer?
Well, that's certainly a possibility. But that would mean he's done this before, or at least in the 3 years since. Let me ask you this. Have either of you been involved in a murder like this before? Because I sure haven't.
Me?
What if our guy doesn't have a relationship with our victim? What if our man is a transient? He is a tourist. He's here for a time and then he's gone again. And he is elsewhere doing the same thing. We've never considered it.
Which means if we're going to catch this guy, we're going to need to start looking at similar cases outside of Colorado. Let's go. All right, listen up.
Kenda and his team expand their search to a national scale.
So we've put together a broadcast to all law enforcement agencies in the U.S. describing our crime and asking for similar offenses or similar MOs by perpetrators in departments to tiny ones. The national broadcast is out for a while and we're not getting much results.
Hey, Kenda, I think I've got something here.
But all of a sudden we do.
It's from Florida.
Lou Smith found a correspondence from a homicide detective in St. Petersburg, Florida, mentioning a James Lamar Rhodes.
The guy's 26 years old. It says here he's raped and attempted murder of 4 different girls with a knife. He's also suspected of 2 full-blown murders. Sound familiar?
Rhodes had abducted 4 young girls in 45 days. One of them sounded remarkably similar to Cynthia's.
In June of 1984, a 17-year-old girl who worked at an ice cream shop went outside end of her shift.
Hey, you want to go for a jog?
And a man approached her.
Come on. What are you doing? Let me go!
I wouldn't say a word if I were you.
The man then took her to a secluded place by some railroad tracks and proceeded to... James Rhodes left her for dead. But she did not die.
Somehow she survived and was able to identify Rose as a suspect, and the physical evidence confirmed it. And guess where the bastard was December '82? Colorado Springs.
He was living in Colorado Springs for approximately 60 days during the time frame that the Cynthia McLuhan case occurred.
So how do we find this guy?
Well, he's currently in Florida prison. He's serving 6 consecutive life sentences for attempted murder.
Looks like we need to go to Florida.
When somebody gives you a series of facts that are so good, that fit perfectly with what you're doing, you can feel it. This is him. There is no doubt in anyone's mind that James Lamar Rose is our target. We need to go to Florida and have him.
From him.
You know, I'm game.
I selected Detective Smith because Smith had a gift. He was the most remarkable interrogator I have ever seen. It was almost as if Lou Smith could walk into a field full of cows and in 15 minutes they'd be offering him free milk.
All right, we need to learn as much as we can about him. Anderson, I want you to lead the research on this guy.
You got it. Let's do this.
It's important when a detective sits down with a suspect that you're armed with as much information as you can.
While Smith is en route to Florida, Kenda's team is preparing background info to pass on to him.
Can you hang on a second? So what do you have for me, Anderson?
This guy definitely had his issues. We pulled his psychological profile from the state of Florida. It seems he grew up in a dysfunctional family.
Can I call you back? Thanks. Bye.
James Rhodes suffered a great deal of trauma in his growing up. Watching his father beat his mother, he getting beaten up by his mother. It was a family full of turmoil, full of violence.
So apparently he had a pretty tumultuous relationship with his mother.
Where the hell are you, James?
As James Rhodes reports, his mother was
Over here.
she would hit him mercilessly and in fact encouraged him in many ways to embrace violence.
It seemed he could have harbored hate for women that may have come from his mother.
He was so filled with hate for his mother. He left home when he was 14, and he literally became a drifter.
Looks like Schmidt's gonna have his hands full with this guy.
I'd say.
The following day, Smith arrives at Florida's Cross City Correctional Center to speak with their #1 suspect.
This is Smith's opportunity to work his magic, and he is magical.
Mr. Rhodes, I'd like to thank you for having this meeting with me. I'm Detective Smith.
I understand you want to talk about a case?
Well, actually, James, I really want to talk about you. You see, James, I'm curious as to how you ended up in Colorado a few years back.
No particular reason. I always loved the mountains. I headed over to Colorado Springs and found a job as a roofer.
I did a little carpentry myself.
Yeah?
Yeah, I was not an expert, but, I did some stuff around the house. Made me feel like a man. Like I was really in control. You know what I mean.
Yeah, I know what you mean.
Smith knew how to establish rapport with Rhodes. In a very short period of time, they were chatting as if they were lifelong friends.
James, you probably saw a lot of different places when you were a kid, right? Well, I bet that was hard, having to always be responsible for yourself.
You wouldn't know the half of it.
What do you mean?
You wouldn't believe some of the things I've done and the places I've been. Hell, I'd write a book about it if they wouldn't throw me in the electric chair.
All serial killers are narcissists. They like attention. And I think if it were possible, every psychopathic killer would probably write a book, because they would then have a chance to brag about what they did.
And what would you write about during your stay up there in Colorado?
Oh, you, but I don't want them to fry me.
What if I told you that they won't? The DA says he'll take the death penalty off the table.
All right, I'll tell you what happened.
No. I want you to show me.
Smith says, we're going to transport you back to Colorado, and I want you to walk me through this. I want you to show me what you did.
All right. What the hell?
Not 24 hours later, Kenda picks up Smith and Rhodes at the airport, and they set out on their guided tour of murder.
When James Rhodes came back to Colorado, he wanted to show off. He was going to get one more thrill out of it and show how well he did what he did.
It was right here. I saw her leaving work. Something just came over me.
You didn't know her?
I'd never seen her before.
Opening her windows on her car.
Hey.
And he walked up behind her.
Can I help you?
Oh, no, I got it. Thanks.
Come on, let me help you.
No, it's fine. Wait!
Get in the car! Shut up! Come back here! Come back here!
He said he threw her in his car.
Get in the car! Shut up! Come back here!
Now, Cynthia McLuhan weighed 107 pounds. He could easily take physical control of her.
Let's go.
He said he wound up in a cemetery, a secluded area.
Right over here. This is where it was. I took out the knife and I told her to get on the ground.
Please don't kill me.
Get on the ground.
I will do anything.
Get
He disrobed her.
Get off me.
He raped her. Then he said she tried to grab the knife, and it infuriated him. It's that knife. He said, I remember that I'll stab people more than a few times. I don't know why I stabbed her so many. 25 times, you say? God, that's really nuts, isn't it? Yes, James, it really is nuts. Just like you.
Frankly, I think he was enjoying himself so much he couldn't stop. He saw Cynthia McLuhan as this object to play with, and it seems quite possible he continued his play with her by posing her.
He left her. He had her clothing in the car, and he thought he had to get rid of that. So he drove by this motel and dumps the clothing in the purse.
What'd you do with her bra and panties?
I don't remember.
I find that hard to believe.
He has a good memory, and yet he says he doesn't remember certain things, and that's nonsense. He does remember.
All right, let's go.
But for whatever reason, he doesn't want to say it.
The state of Colorado convicts James Rhodes of first-degree murder and sentences him to life in prison. But he won't be serving that time just yet.
Florida has first dibs on this guy, so he goes back to Florida to serve 6 consecutive life terms. And if he survives that, he comes to Colorado to serve yet another one.
In Florida, James Rhodes is suspected of killing up to 10 other young women. However, none of those cases have been proven.
One of the major misconceptions about serial killers is that they are crazy. They are not crazy. They are very disturbed. Their impulses seem to reign freely in a way that's more consistent with a wild animal than a human being.
He was just a monster. How can somebody do the awful things that he did and leave a little girl without her mother?
Before Bruce MacArthur became a name known across Canada, before investigators began digging through gardens and searching properties connected to him, before photographs of his face appeared across newspapers and television screens, there was something far more difficult to see. There was a pattern. But patterns are rarely visible while they are being created. Imagine standing in the middle of Toronto and looking at the city from above. The streets form lines beneath you. Buildings rise into the sky. Cars move through intersections. From that distance, everything seems connected. But at street level, every person experiences only a tiny portion of the city. One workplace. One group of friends. One familiar route home. One man disappears from one part of the city. Another disappears years later. A third man stops answering his phone. Someone reports a missing person. A family waits. A police file is opened. Questions are asked. And then the case becomes part of a mountain of unresolved human stories. The problem is not that nobody cares. The problem is that nobody can see the entire picture. Not yet. In the case of Bruce MacArthur, the picture would take years to emerge. And perhaps the most unsettling part was that the person eventually placed at the center of that picture was not living somewhere outside society. He was already inside it. He knew the streets. He knew the neighborhoods. He knew people. He knew how to make himself appear ordinary. And ordinary people are often given something dangerous. Trust. Not absolute trust. Not the kind of trust reserved for family. Something much simpler. The trust we give to people whose presence does not immediately make us uncomfortable. A person arrives at a house to do landscaping. There is nothing equipment. He walks through a backyard. He looks at trees, plants, soil, fences. He talks about what needs to be trimmed. What needs to be removed. What needs to be planted. The homeowner goes inside. The landscaper remains outside. The scene is so ordinary that the mind does not search for danger. That is what makes the profession so relevant to the story. MacArthur did not need to force his way into every part of people's lives. Sometimes, people opened the door for him. And once someone has been invited into a private space, the boundary between stranger and familiar person can disappear remarkably quickly. That does not mean everyone who knew MacArthur trusted him deeply. It does not mean his neighbors knew nothing about him. And it certainly does not mean that everyone around him was deceived. But the image of a serial killer is often built around the idea of someone visibly monstrous. Someone aggressive. Someone isolated. Someone who seems obviously dangerous. MacArthur did not fit that simple picture. That disconnect would become one of the most disturbing elements of the case. Because evil does not always arrive looking like evil. Sometimes it arrives looking like a routine appointment. Sometimes it remembers someone's name. Sometimes it knows exactly how to behave. And sometimes it waits. 4 years, the men connected to this case lived their own lives. Skandara Navaratnam had his own history. Abdulbasir Faizi had his own family and relationships. Majid Kayhan had his own experiences and connections. Sarush Mahmoodi had built a life in Toronto. Dean Lizowick had people who knew him. Salim Eason had people who expected him to return. Andrew Kinsman had friends who knew his routines. Kirushna Kumar Kanagaratnam had a story that, tragically, would take much longer to become part of the investigation. These men were different from one another. Their lives were not interchangeable. And yet, years later, investigators would discover that their stories had intersected with the same man. That realization changes the way we look backward. Once we know the ending, earlier events suddenly appear different. A person who seemed insignificant becomes important. A meeting becomes suspicious. A disappearance that once seemed isolated becomes part of a sequence. But there is a danger in looking backward with knowledge that the people at the time did not possess. They rarely are. Imagine being the investigator assigned to a missing person case in 2010. You do not know what will happen in 2012. You do not know what will happen in 2015. You do not know that another man will disappear in 2016. You do not know that 2 more men will disappear in 2017. You certainly do not know that the investigation will eventually lead to one of the largest serial murder cases in Toronto's history. You only know that 1 person is missing. That is the reality investigators faced. And for the families, the situation was even more personal. A missing person investigation is built around uncertainty. Death, terrible as it is, creates finality. Disappearance does not. Disappearance creates a door that never completely closes. Every possibility remains open. Maybe he left. Maybe he is avoiding people. Maybe his phone was lost. Maybe he is somewhere safe. Maybe something happened. Maybe tomorrow he will walk through the door. That uncertainty can become its own form of suffering. Time does not necessarily heal it. Sometimes time makes it worse. Because the longer someone is gone, the more hope can survive long after logic has begun to say otherwise. And that hope can become part of everyday life. A family member keeps an old photograph. A friend keeps an old phone number. Someone remembers the last conversation. Someone remembers the clothes the person was wearing. Someone remembers the exact moment they realized something was wrong. And years later, those memories remain. This is the human landscape behind the police timeline. The dates matter. But the spaces between the dates matter too. 2010. 2011. 2012. 2013. 2014. 7 years. 7 years in which Toronto continued to grow, change, celebrate, mourn, work, and sleep. 7 years in which people went to restaurants, attended weddings, raised children, changed jobs, moved homes, and fell in love. 7 years in which the lives of 8 men were gradually erased from the city they had once inhabited. And somewhere inside those years, Bruce MacArthur continued working. He continued interacting with people. He continued appearing ordinary. That is one of the most difficult psychological aspects of the case, for how a person can commit terrible crimes. There is nothing supernatural about it. What is disturbing is how human beings can compartmentalize. How a person can construct different versions of themselves. How someone can behave normally in one context and commit horrific acts in another. How the people around them can see only the version presented to them. The colleague sees one person. The client sees another. The friend sees another. The family member sees another. The victim may encounter a version that almost nobody else knows exists. This is not unique to MacArthur. It is one of the reasons violent offenders can remain hidden in ordinary communities. People do not walk around with labels above their heads. There is no visible mark separating the dangerous from the safe. And because most people are not dangerous, society is built on the assumption that strangers are usually just strangers. We interact. We trust. We move on. MacArthur existed inside that system. And for years, nobody knew the full truth. Then the disappearances began to form a disturbing cluster. The Church Wellesley area became increasingly important. For Toronto's LGBTQ collection of streets and businesses. It was a place where people could meet others like themselves. A place of community. A place where friendships could form. A place where people who might have felt isolated elsewhere could find connection. That made the disappearances particularly frightening. Because if people could vanish from within a familiar social environment, then the feeling of safety itself could begin to fracture. The fear was not only about one person. It was about possibility. Who could be next? Who could be trusted? Was someone watching? Was there a predator moving through the same places everyone else considered familiar? These questions would grow louder as more men disappeared. But for years, the evidence was incomplete. There was no single crime scene linking everything. There was no confession. There was no body connecting all the cases. There was no clear suspect standing at the center. There were only fragments. And fragments can be deceptive. A photograph. A phone record. A witness statement. A vehicle. A conversation. A person's last known location. Individually, each piece may appear small. Together, they can become devastating. Kinsman disappeared. His case would be different. Kinsman's disappearance created a trail that investigators could follow. There were digital clues. There were connections. There were people who knew him. And, critically, there was a link to Bruce MacArthur. Suddenly, MacArthur was no longer just another person in the background. He became a person of interest. Investigators began watching him. They began examining his movements. They began looking at the people around him. And they began asking questions that had not been asked before. Where had MacArthur been? Who had he contacted? Who had he met? What places had he visited? What did he know? And perhaps most importantly, what was he hiding? As the investigation intensified, the ordinary image began to collapse. MacArthur was no longer simply a landscaper. He was a potential link between missing people. And once police began looking closely at him, they had to consider a possibility that would have seemed extraordinary only months earlier. What if the disappearances were connected? What if the man they were watching had not simply encountered one missing person? What if he had encountered several? And what if those encounters became more urgent? Police surveillance intensified. Evidence was gathered. The clock kept moving. And MacArthur continued living in a world that had not yet fully understood what was happening. This is where the case takes on a strange quality. There is a period in almost every major investigation when the suspect may know that police are watching. The balance changes. The hunter becomes aware that he may be hunted. Every movement matters. Every conversation matters. Every mistake matters. Investigators know that the suspect may destroy evidence, alter behavior, disappear, or attempt to create an innocent explanation. The suspect knows that investigators are searching for something. And somewhere between those two sides is the truth. In January 2018, that tension reached its breaking point. Police had gathered enough evidence to move. On January 18, Bruce MacArthur was arrested. For the public, the arrest answered one question. Who was being investigated? But it created another. How many victims? At first, the charges involved Andrew Kinsman and Salim Eason. 2 men. 2 murders. The public knew those names. They continued searching. They continued examining MacArthur's properties and the locations associated with his work. And then they found something that changed the investigation forever. Human remains. Not one discovery that neatly closed the case. Something larger. Something that forced investigators to look again at the entire history of missing men in Toronto. The places connected to MacArthur became crime scenes. Gardens were examined. Soil was disturbed. Properties were searched with painstaking care. Investigators moved slowly because every inch could matter. A small fragment could become a name. A name could become a family. A family could finally receive an answer. And as the evidence accumulated, the list grew. Saroush Mahmoodi. Mojid Kayhan. Dean Lizowick. Skandara Navaratnam. Abdulbasir Faizi. Kirushna Kumar Kanagaratnam. Andrew Kinsman. Salim Eason. 8 men. 8 separate stories. And now, increasingly, one investigation. The case had become something much larger than the disappearance of Andrew Kinsman. It was a reconstruction of years. In 2017. They were asking what had happened before. They were going backward. 2016. 2017. 2018. 2019. The further back they went, the more disturbing the pattern became. And perhaps that is what makes the timeline of this case so haunting. The answer was not hidden in one moment. It was distributed across years. The truth was scattered. And someone had to collect every piece. For the families, the discovery of the remains brought an unbearable contradiction. Answers were finally arriving. But answers were arriving in the worst possible form. For years, A family can tell itself that there is still a chance. Then investigators arrive with the truth. The person they have been waiting for is not coming home. There is no reunion. No final phone call. No explanation that can make the loss acceptable. There is only confirmation. And after confirmation comes grief. A different kind of grief. A grief with a name. A grief with a date. The investigation would eventually reveal that MacArthur had been connected to 8 deaths. But the discovery did something else. It changed the meaning of the year. Were no longer isolated tragedies. They were chapters. And the city had unknowingly been living inside the story. Every year that had passed was now evidence of something. Every missing person file became part of a larger question. Could these cases have been connected sooner? Were warning signs missed? Were assumptions made? Did the victims receive the attention they deserved? Could someone have seen the pattern earlier? Those questions would follow Toronto long after MacArthur was behind bars. Because catching a killer does not automatically resolve every failure that allowed a killer to remain free. Sometimes the arrest is not the end of an investigation. It is the beginning of an investigation into the investigation itself. And that would become one of the defining elements of the MacArthur case. The city had to look at itself. The police had to look at themselves. Communities had to ask whether some disappearances had been treated differently because of who the missing people were. And families had to live with the knowledge that the man responsible had been moving through the same city while they were searching for answers. That is a terrible thing to understand after the fact. To realize that the person you feared might be somewhere out there was not hiding somewhere distant. Working. Driving. Talking. Walking through neighborhoods. Perhaps passing people who knew nothing. Perhaps passing people who were still waiting for someone to return. And that is why the story of Bruce MacArthur is not simply a story about a serial killer. It is a story about visibility. About who gets noticed. Who gets believed. Who gets searched for. Who gets remembered. And how easily a human being can become a missing person poster instead of a person in the eyes of the wider public. The 8 men at the center of this case deserved more than that. They deserved to be known for their lives, not only for the circumstances of their deaths. They deserved to be remembered as sons, brothers, friends, partners, neighbors, and members of a community. And before this story moves deeper into the investigation, there is one fact that must remain at its center. Bruce MacArthur was eventually found guilty because the evidence led investigators to him. But the investigation began because people disappeared. That distinction matters. The story did not begin with a killer. It began with people who were missed. People whose absence was noticed. People whose family. And as we move forward, we are going to return to those names. Not as numbers. Not as evidence. Not as victims in a list. But as human beings. Because before Bruce MacArthur became the most important name in this story, there were 8 other names. And those names should come first. Skandara Navaratnam. Abdulbasir Faizi. Mojid Kayhan. Sarush Mahmoodi. Dean Lizowick. Salim Eason. Andrew Kinsman. Karushna Kumar Kanagaratnam. 8 lives. 8 disappearances. 1 investigation. And a city that would eventually discover that the answer had been hiding in plain sight. But before investigators could understand how these men became connected, they had to understand the place where many of their stories intersected. A neighborhood filled with life. A community built around belonging. A part of Toronto where people came to find friendship, identity, and freedom. And beneath that familiar surface, a darkness that would take years to reveal itself. That is where the story takes us next. To Toronto. To Church, Wellesley Village. And to the world that existed before anyone knew the name Bruce MacArthur would nations in Canada's recent history. Toronto is a city that knows how to hide things. Not because it is a dark city. Quite the opposite. It is bright, busy, restless, full of people moving in every direction, crossing streets beneath glass towers, stepping onto crowded trains, carrying coffee through the morning rush, laughing with friends beneath the neon lights of downtown. It is a city where millions of lives overlap without ever truly touching. And perhaps that is what makes a place like Toronto so difficult to understand when something terrible happens. Because sometimes, the most frightening things do not happen in abandoned buildings. They happen in ordinary neighborhoods, behind ordinary doors, inside ordinary houses. And sometimes, the person responsible does not look like the monster people imagine when they hear the words serial killer. He looks like a man who could pass you on the sidewalk without attracting a second glance. A man with work to do, clients to visit, gardens to maintain, people to greet. A man who can stand in someone's backyard with dirt beneath his fingernails, trimming branches and arranging plants, while nobody around him realizes that they may be standing in the shadow of something much darker. For years, his name was Bruce MacArthur. And between 2010 and 2017, 8 men disappeared. 8 lives. 8 families left with unanswered questions. 8 stories that, for years, seemed to exist separately from one another. Some of the men had families. Some had friends who expected them to call. Some had built lives in Canada after leaving other countries. Some were deeply connected to Toronto's LGBTQ+ community. And some were living on the edges of society, in circumstances that could make a disappearance easier to overlook. They did not all vanish in the same year. They did not all disappear from the same street. They did not all leave behind the same clues. There was no single night when Toronto suddenly understood that a predator was hunting among them. Instead, the disappearances accumulated quietly. One man vanished. Then another. Then another. Years passed. Life continued. People moved apartments. Businesses opened and closed. The seasons changed. Winter buried the streets beneath snow. Spring returned. Summer filled the city with crowds. Autumn covered sidewalks in fallen leaves. Disappearances were slowly becoming pieces of the same story. But nobody knew it yet. Not the families. Not the friends. Not the public. And, for a long time, not even the police. The story would eventually become one of the most disturbing criminal investigations in modern Canadian history. But it did not begin with the discovery of 8 bodies. It began with something much quieter. A person who did not come home. A phone that stopped ringing. A door that remained closed. A family member looking at the clock and realizing that something was wrong. In 2010, Skandara Navaratnam disappeared. He was one of the first men whose disappearance would later be connected to MacArthur. At the time, however, there was no clear reason to believe that his disappearance belonged to anything larger. There was no public face of a killer. No photograph of a suspect appearing on television. No warning that 8 years of investigation were about to begin. There was simply a missing man. Then came Abdulbasir Besa Faizi. Another disappearance. Another family waiting. Another empty space where a person should have been. The years moved forward. In 2012, Mojid Han. 2015, Saroush Mahmoudi. In 2016, Dean Lizowick. Each disappearance was its own tragedy. Each man had his own history, his own relationships, his own personality, his own reason for waking up in the morning. But when a person disappears, the outside world often reduces them to a single word. Missing. That word can be deceptively small. It hides the unanswered phone calls. It hides the photographs taken down from walls. It hides the clothing left behind. It hides the questions that families ask themselves late at night. Did he leave voluntarily? Was he in trouble? Did something happen? Should we have noticed something? Should we have done something differently? And the most painful question of all. Will he ever come back? For some families, hope can survive for years. A missing person is not the same thing as a confirmed death. There is always the possibility, however small, that the next knock on the door might change everything. But in the case of these men, the truth was moving in the opposite direction. They were not coming home. And someone in Toronto knew why. Then came 2017. A year that would finally begin pulling the Kinsman disappeared. Kinsman was 49 years old. Unlike some earlier cases, his disappearance would become a critical turning point. People knew him. He had friends. He had a life. And when he vanished, there were details surrounding his disappearance that demanded attention. Among those details was a connection to a man named Bruce MacArthur. MacArthur was not an obvious suspect in the way people imagine a serial killer should be. He was not hiding in a remote cabin. He was not living under a false name. He was not a stranger who had appeared from nowhere. He was a landscaper. A familiar figure in Toronto. A man who worked around houses and gardens. A man who knew how to enter private properties because people had invited him there. A man whose profession gave him something that would later become deeply significant: access. Access to homes. Access to gardens. Access to places where people might not think twice about seeing him. And access to people. There was another disappearance in 2017. Salim Eason vanished as well. 2 men. 1 city. The same year. Connections began to appear. Not as a question. Could these disappearances be connected? In August 2017, Toronto Police Service launched Project Prism, an investigation focused on the disappearances of Andrew Kinsman and Salim Eason. At first, investigators were still trying to understand what they were looking at. Was this coincidence? Were these unrelated disappearances? Were the men victims of separate circumstances? Or was there something much more deliberate happening beneath the surface? Investigators began pulling at the threads. And the more they pulled, the more uncomfortable the picture became. MacArthur's name kept appearing. His relationship with people connected to the missing men drew attention. His movements became important. His communications became important. His vehicles became important. And slowly, the ordinary image of Bruce MacArthur began to crack. Not all at once. There was no single moment when everyone suddenly knew who he was. Instead, suspicion grew in small increments. A detail here. A connection there. A piece of evidence that seemed insignificant until placed beside another. And then another. This is often how a major criminal investigation, not with detectives standing over a table and instantly seeing the answer. Real investigations can be painfully slow. They involve thousands of pages. Hours of surveillance. Interviews. Records. Images. Digital information. Tiny inconsistencies. Things that mean nothing on their own. And things that become terrifying once their meaning changes. By late 2017, investigators were looking more closely at Bruce MacArthur. And then something happened that transformed suspicion into something far more serious. Evidence began pointing toward the possibility that Andrew Kinsman had been murdered. MacArthur was no longer simply a person connected to a missing man. He was becoming a suspect in a homicide investigation. But even then, investigators did not yet know the full scale of what they were dealing with. They did not yet know that behind the disappearance of Kinsman might be another disappearance. And another. And another. They did not yet know that the timeline stretched back years. They did not yet know that the name Bruce MacArthur would eventually be connected to 8 first-degree murders. And they certainly did not know what they were going to find when they began looking beneath the surface. MacArthur was a landscaper. And landscaping is about changing what people see. A garden can be rearranged. A patch of soil can be disturbed and then made to look untouched. Plants grow. Leaves fall. Seasons pass. The earth changes. And the ordinary appearance of a backyard can conceal an extraordinary amount of history. That detail would become one of the most haunting elements of the entire case. In January 2018, investigators were closing in. The man who had spent years moving through Toronto's streets as an ordinary citizen was now under intense police scrutiny. He was being watched. His communications were being examined. Investigators were collecting evidence. They were building a case piece by piece. And on January 18, 2018, Bruce MacArthur was arrested. At first, he was charged with the murders of Andrew Kinsman and Salim Eason. 2 names. 2 charges. But the investigation was not finished. It was only beginning to reveal its true scale. Because once investigators started searching places connected to MacArthur, the case changed forever. What they found was not simply evidence of one missing man, connected to multiple missing men. Some of those remains were found in residential properties where MacArthur had worked as a landscaper. And suddenly, the question was no longer whether Andrew Kinsman had been killed. The question became, how many? How many men had crossed paths with Bruce MacArthur? How many disappearances had investigators previously considered unrelated? How many families had spent years waiting for answers? And perhaps most disturbingly, how long had this been happening? As investigators searched, the list of names grew. Saroush Mahmoodi, Mojid Kayhan, Dean Lizowick, Skandara Navaratnam, Abdulbasir Faizi, Kirushna Kumar Kanagaratnam, Andrew Kinsman, Salim Eason. 8 men, 8 lives, 8 families, and 1 name connecting them, Bruce MacArthur. But a list of names can never tell the whole story. Because these men were not simply entries in a police file. They had birthdays. They had favorite foods. They had people who knew the sound of their laughter. They had plans. They had memories that existed long before their names appeared in headlines. And their stories should not end there. That is one of the hardest things to remember when telling a true crime story. The killer often becomes the most recognizable name. The investigation becomes the spectacle. The evidence becomes the mystery. The courtroom becomes the climax. But behind all of it are people who had lives before the crime ever happened. The 8 men connected to Bruce MacArthur were not characters created for a crime story. They were human beings. And for their families, the disappearance of a loved one was not an episode. It was an absence that continued every morning, every birthday, every holiday, every time an old photograph appeared, every time someone asked, "Do you remember him?" So as we enter the story of Bruce MacArthur, we have to resist one temptation. We cannot begin by asking only, who was the killer? We have to ask another question first. Who were the people whose lives were taken? Because somewhere beneath the headlines, beneath the police investigation, beneath the photographs of the suspect, beneath the court documents and the evidence boxes, there were 8 individual stories. And those stories matter. Still, there is one reason this case remains so difficult to comprehend. Man hiding from the world. He lived inside it. He worked inside it. He moved through it. He interacted with people. He entered homes. He maintained gardens. He spoke with clients. He existed in the same city as everyone else. And while people were going about their daily lives, someone was disappearing. For years, the city did not see the pattern. Or perhaps the pattern was there, but it was too scattered to recognize. 1 disappearance could be explained. 2 could be coincidence. 3 could still be unrelated. Years can separate events. People can move. Evidence can disappear. Memories can fade. And when the victims come from communities that may already feel overlooked, the warning signs can become even easier for the wider public to miss. That is what makes this story larger than one man. It is a story about what happens when disappearances are treated as isolated events. It is a story about assumptions. About blind spots. About the danger of believing that evil always announces itself. And it is a story about how an ordinary-looking man could remain in plain sight while a trail of unanswered disappearances slowly formed behind him. Years had passed. The city had changed. The missing men had become memories. Families had waited. And Bruce MacArthur had continued living his life. Until one investigation began pulling those memories together. Until one missing man's story led investigators to another. And another. Until the name of a landscaper became connected to 8 deaths. Until gardens that had once seemed peaceful became crime scenes. Until the ground itself began giving up secrets. And until Toronto was forced to confront a terrifying possibility. What if the man people had been walking past for years had been standing much closer to the truth than anyone realized? Bruce McArthur would eventually plead guilty to 8 counts of first-degree murder. He would eventually receive a life sentence with no possibility of parole for 25 years. The legal case would end. But the questions would not. Because justice can answer who committed a crime. It can establish guilt. It can impose a sentence. But it cannot restore the years taken from a family. It cannot return a son, a brother, a friend. It cannot erase the empty chair at a dinner table. It cannot undo and it cannot change the fact that, for years, 8 men disappeared while the city continued moving around them. That is where this story truly begins. Not with the arrest. Not with the courtroom. Not even with the discovery that would shock Toronto. It begins years earlier, when the first man disappeared and the world did not yet understand what his disappearance meant. It begins with 8 lives that would eventually be tied to one name. And it begins with a city that had no idea that somewhere beneath its ordinary routines, a pattern was already taking shape. A pattern that would remain invisible until it was almost too late. Because sometimes the most frightening question in a murder investigation is not, who did it? It is, how long had he been doing it before anyone saw? Toronto was already awake by the time most people realized something was wrong. The city did not stop for missing people. Streetcars continued along their routes. Traffic moved through downtown. Restaurants opened their doors. Office workers crossed intersections with their eyes fixed on the changing lights. People hurried toward trains, carrying the small concerns of ordinary life. A meeting at 9. A message that needed a reply. A child who needed to be picked birthday. A dinner reservation. The machinery of a major city does not pause because one person has disappeared. That is one of the cruelest things about disappearance. For the person who is gone, the world has stopped. For everyone else, it keeps moving. And for the family left behind, that contrast can become unbearable. The city continues to produce new mornings while they remain trapped inside an unanswered question. Where is he? What happened? Why hasn't he called? Will someone find him? The longer the question remains unanswered, the more it changes. At first, it is a question filled with hope. Then concern. Then fear. Then exhaustion. And eventually, for some families, it becomes something they carry every day. A permanent absence. That was the reality surrounding the men whose names would eventually be connected to Bruce McArthur. But there was another reality unfolding at the same time. McArthur was not living as though the world were closing in around him. He continued to exist within ordinary routines. He continued to work. He continued to meet people. He continued to move around Toronto. And the city residents. There is something profoundly unsettling about that. We like to imagine that dangerous people eventually reveal themselves. That someone who commits terrible acts must behave differently. That there must be something in their expression. Something in their voice. Something in the way they stand. Something that warns us. But there is no reliable visual language for evil. A face does not tell you what a person has done. A profession does not tell you what a person is capable of. A polite conversation does not guarantee someone's intentions. McArthur's occupation made his presence in residential spaces seem natural. He was a landscaper. He knew how to work with gardens. He knew how to maintain outdoor spaces. He knew how to move around private properties without immediately appearing out of place. That distinction would become horrifyingly important. Because when investigators eventually searched places connected to him, they were not searching some abandoned warehouse at the edge of the city. They were searching gardens, private homes, places associated with ordinary domestic life, places where people planted flowers, Places where families sat outside in the summer. Places where children to represent safety. The transformation of those spaces into crime scenes was symbolic in a way that went beyond the physical evidence. A garden is normally associated with growth, with seasons, with patience. A seed disappears beneath soil and, months later, something living emerges. The earth is expected to hide nothing more sinister than roots and stones. But in the MacArthur investigation, the ground became part of the evidence. The places where investigators once expected to find plants became places where they searched for human remains. And that changed the emotional geography of the case. It meant that the danger was no longer an abstract idea somewhere out in the city. It had been inside people's private spaces. Behind fences. Inside backyards. Close enough to ordinary life that nobody looking from the street would have known. That realization would eventually make people question every place connected to MacArthur. Every property. Every garden. Every memory. Every time someone remembered seeing him working outside a house. But none of that was known when the first men disappeared. Back then, there was no reason to look at a landscaper and imagine a serial killer. There was no because they had disappeared from the same city. There was no reason to assume that years apart could still belong to the same story. That is what made the eventual discovery so devastating. The truth had not appeared suddenly. It had been accumulating. Quietly. Patiently. One disappearance at a time. The first names entered the story in 2010. Skandara Navaratnam. Then Abdulbasir Faizi. Two men whose disappearances would later become part of the same criminal case. But in the beginning, they were not part of a historical case. They were individuals. Their families did not know they were the first pages of a story that would eventually stretch across nearly a decade. There was no title for what was happening. No public understanding of a serial killer. No warning that the next disappearance might be connected. Years passed. Then came Mojid Kayhan. Then Saroush Mahmoodi. Then Dean Lizowick. 5 names. 5 disappearances. And still the full pattern remained hidden. Imagine what that means from the perspective of time. The first disappearance happens. Life continues. Another man disappears. Life continues. Another person vanishes. The world does not suddenly rearrange itself around the possibility that a predator is operating among ordinary people. Instead, each event is absorbed into its own explanation. People search. Police investigate. Families hope. Friends speculate. And eventually, the attention moves elsewhere. Not because the missing person stops mattering, but because society has limited attention. News cycles change. New stories appear. People become accustomed to uncertainty. That is one of the most dangerous things about repeated tragedy. People can become numb to patterns they do not yet understand. Then came 2017. Andrew Kinsman disappeared. And something about this disappearance would be different. There were clues that investigators could follow. There were connections that could be examined. There were digital traces. And there was a man whose name would increasingly appear alongside Kinsman's. Bruce MacArthur. For the first time, the investigation began moving toward a person rather than simply searching for an unknown explanation. The focus narrowed. MacArthur's movements became important. His relationships became important. Investigators began looking at what had happened before Kinsman's disappearance. They looked at what happened afterward. And when they did, they found details that did not sit comfortably together. That discomfort is often where a major investigation begins. Not certainty. Not proof. Discomfort. A feeling that the obvious explanation does not explain everything. Investigators follow that feeling with evidence. They ask questions. They compare timelines. They examine records. They look for contradictions. They test assumptions. And sometimes, the more they investigate, the more complicated the picture becomes. By August 2017, Project Prism was underway. At that moment, the investigation was still centered around missing people. But beneath the surface, something larger was beginning to emerge. The name MacArthur was becoming difficult to ignore. And the question changed. It was no longer simply, "Where are these men?" It became, "What happened to them?" That distinction is enormous. A missing person investigation searches for possibilities. A homicide investigation, investigators were right. The difference meant that the city was no longer searching for people who might still be alive. It was searching for a killer. But they did not yet know how many victims there were. They did not yet know how long the pattern had existed. They did not yet know what would be found. They only knew that something was wrong. Then, as surveillance intensified, the case began moving toward its first major confrontation. Police watched MacArthur. They studied his movements. They gathered evidence. They examined his connections. They searched for the point where suspicion could become probable cause. And MacArthur continued to live under the surface of ordinary life. That period is difficult to reconstruct emotionally because the investigators knew they were watching a potential killer, while the public largely did not. To everyone outside the investigation, Toronto was still Toronto. Busy. Crowded. Ordinary. But somewhere inside the machinery of the city, detectives were assembling a picture that was becoming darker by the day. The arrest on January 18, 2018, was therefore not the beginning of the story. It was the moment the hidden story became visible. When MacArthur was arrested, the postman and Salim Eason. Two names became headlines. But investigators knew they had to keep going. Because evidence was pointing beyond those two men. The search continued. And then came the discoveries that would transform the case. Human remains. The first discovery was horrifying. The subsequent discoveries were worse. Because every new set of remains meant that another family could receive an answer. But every answer carried its own devastation. The investigation was now doing something almost impossible. It was reconstructing lives from fragments. Investigators had to identify remains. They had to compare evidence. They had to connect physical discoveries to missing person reports. They had to determine what happened and when. They had to build a timeline. And behind every forensic process was a human consequence. A name. A family. A photograph. A person who had once walked through the streets of Toronto. As more names were connected to MacArthur, the scale of the case became impossible to ignore. This was not one murder. It was not two. The number continued rising. 3. 4. 7. 8. 8 first-degree murder charges. 8 men. 8 stories that had once seemed separate. And suddenly, the years between their disappearances took on a new meaning. 2010 was no longer just the year one man disappeared. It was the beginning of a pattern. 2012 was no longer an isolated disappearance. 2015 was no longer unrelated. 2016 was no longer simply another missing person case. 2017 was the year the pattern finally began to reveal itself. The timeline became a map. And on that map, one name kept appearing. Bruce MacArthur. There is a psychological phenomenon that often occurs when people discover something terrible after the fact. They begin reconstructing the past. They remember small details. They reconsider conversations. They wonder whether something they once ignored was actually important. They ask themselves whether they should have noticed. Whether they could have done something. Whether someone else could have. This kind of hindsight can be cruel. Because people judge their past decisions using information they did not have at the time. The families of the missing. The friends did not know. The community did not know. Even investigators did not know at first. The full picture existed only in fragments. And the person at the center of it had every reason to keep those fragments separated. That is why the investigation became a race against time. Not necessarily because MacArthur was still committing murders at that exact moment. But because investigators had to determine the extent of the danger before more evidence disappeared, more questions became impossible to answer, or more victims remained unidentified. The search of properties associated with MacArthur became increasingly important. Investigators examined soil. They searched gardens. They looked beneath structures. They searched areas where someone working in landscaping might have had legitimate access. Every discovery forced them to ask another question. Was this connected? Was another missing person here? Was there more? The answer, repeatedly, was yes. And perhaps the most chilling realization was that MacArthur's profession had given him an unusual relationship with the physical spaces investigators were now examining. He knew gardens. He knew soil. He knew how outdoor spaces grow. He understood the environment in ways that an ordinary person might not. The same knowledge that allowed him to make a living would become part of the landscape of the investigation. That is why the phrase landscaper serial killer became so closely associated with the case. But behind that phrase was something much more painful. Real people had disappeared. Real families had waited. Real investigators had spent years trying to understand what had happened. And real communities had been forced to confront a terrifying question. Could someone have been watching them all along? The answer was yes. And that answer changed Toronto. It changed how people thought about missing persons. It changed how the LGBTQ+ community looked at safety. It changed how police examined their own investigations. And it changed how the public understood the difference between an ordinary face and an ordinary person. Because MacArthur's story was not frightening because he looked monstrous. It was frightening because he did not need to. He could stand among other people and look like he belonged. He could have a conversation. He could go to work. He could enter a home. He could walk away. And then, when nobody was watching, the lives of other people makes the case so difficult to forget. The human mind likes clear categories. Good people. Bad people. Safe places. Dangerous places. Normal behavior. Abnormal behavior. But real life does not always respect those boundaries. The most dangerous person in a room may not be the loudest. The safest looking place may not be completely safe. And the person everyone assumes is harmless may be hiding something nobody else can see. That does not mean we should live in fear of everyone around us. It means that evil does not always announce itself. Sometimes it hides behind routine, behind familiarity, behind a profession, behind a reputation, behind the assumption that someone could never do such a thing. And for years, Bruce MacArthur benefited from that assumption. Until one missing man created a trail. Until investigators followed it. Until the trail led to a landscaper. Until the landscaper became a suspect. Until the suspect became an accused murderer. And until the search for one missing man opened the door to a much larger nightmare. But even then, there was still another story that needed to be told. The story. A neighborhood filled with people who had built a community around belonging. A neighborhood that had become a gathering place for Toronto's LGBTQ+ population. A neighborhood where people could meet friends, find relationships, celebrate who they were and, for many, finally feel at home. That place matters. Because understanding the MacArthur case requires more than knowing the dates of disappearances. It requires understanding the world in which those disappearances occurred. It requires understanding why certain people came together in particular places. Why some men were connected to one another. Why disappearances created fear. Why suspicion grew slowly. And why, when the investigation finally exploded into public view, the community did not simply ask who the killer was. They asked another question. Why did it take so long? That question would become one of the most painful parts of the aftermath. Because finding a killer can bring justice. But it can also expose everything that happened before the killer was found. The missed opportunities. The assumptions. The gaps. The unanswered calls. The cases that did not connect. The people who had warned that something was wrong. And the faffing around them. Bruce MacArthur would eventually stand in court and admit responsibility for the deaths of 8 men. There would be no mystery left about whether he was responsible for those murders. No courtroom drama capable of changing the outcome. No jury forced to decide between competing stories. The evidence would be laid out. The facts would be acknowledged. And the sentence would come. But the most important part of the story would remain outside the courtroom. It would remain with the families. With the friends. With the community. With the people who knew these men before the world knew them as victims. That is why this story should not be told as a celebration of a killer's notoriety. Bruce MacArthur's name became famous. But fame is not the same thing as importance. The important names are the ones he tried to erase. The names of the men who had lives before they became missing person cases. The names of the families who refused to forget them. The names that investigators eventually recovered from years of uncertainty. 8 men. 8 lives. And behind every name, an entire world. So before we follow the investigation deeper, before we examine the evidence that finally brought MacArthur down, police files for a moment. We need to step away from the suspect. And we need to look at the people who were here before the headlines. Because the first question in a story like this should never be, what did the killer do? The first question should be, who were the people he took from the world? That is where their stories begin. And that is where ours should begin too. Toronto is waiting outside. The streets are full. The buildings are standing. The neighborhoods are alive. But now, knowing what happened, those familiar streets carry a different weight. A man once walked through them and never came home. Then another. Then another. For years, nobody knew why. Until one investigation finally connected the dots. And when the dots were connected, they revealed something that had been hiding beneath the ordinary surface of the city. Not a monster from a distant place. Not a stranger living beyond the boundaries of society. But a man who had been part of the landscape. A man who knew the city. A man who knew its people. A man who knew how to make himself look ordinary. His name was Bruce MacArthur. But before we tell the story of the man who would become one of Canada's most notorious serial killers, stolen. Because they were here first. They lived here first. They mattered before their names appeared in a criminal investigation. And they deserve to remain more than a list of victims. They deserve to be remembered as people. The investigation would eventually tell us how they died. The courtroom would tell us who was responsible. But before either of those things, there is a question that cannot be answered by police reports alone. Who were they when they were still alive? To understand that, we have to go back. Back before the arrest. Back before the surveillance. Back before Project Prism. Back before the gardens were searched. Back before Toronto learned the name Bruce MacArthur. Back to a city full of people who believed they knew the places where they were safe. And back to the neighborhood where so many threads of this story would eventually meet. Church, Wellesley Village. The heart of a community. A place of belonging. A place of friendship. A place filled with ordinary lives. And, unbeknownst to almost everyone, a place that would become the setting for one of the darkest criminal investigations in modern Canadian history. Church, Wellesley Village was not simply a place on a map. For many people in Toronto, it was a place where people could walk through the city without feeling like they had to explain themselves. A place where identity was visible. Where friendships formed quickly. Where people could meet after work, after school, after a difficult day, or simply because they wanted to be around people who understood them. The neighborhood had its own rhythm. Its own language. Its own memories. And like every neighborhood that becomes important to a community, it was built not only from buildings and businesses, but from the people who returned to the same streets again and again. Someone knew the bartender. Someone knew the person behind the counter at a familiar cafe. Someone recognized a face from the previous weekend. Someone had a friend who knew another friend. In a large city, that kind of familiarity can feel surprisingly powerful. Toronto can make a person anonymous. Church, Wellesley Village could do the opposite. It could make a person visible. That visibility could be comforting. But it could also mean that when someone disappeared, people noticed. And when several people disappeared over a period of years, some members of the community began to wonder whether those disappearances were connected. It grew slowly. At first, a disappearance is just a disappearance, or routines. People move. Relationships end. People struggle privately. Some leave without telling anyone. Some become unreachable because they are in trouble. Some simply choose to disappear from a life they no longer want. That is why every missing person case begins in uncertainty. The people searching for answers have to consider possibilities that may later prove completely wrong. And while they are considering those possibilities, time continues moving. In Toronto, time moves quickly. The city is constantly rebuilding itself. Old buildings disappear. New ones rise. Businesses change hands. People move into new apartments. People move out. A familiar street can look different after only a few years. That constant change would become important when investigators eventually tried to reconstruct what had happened between 2010 and 2017. Because the case did not unfold in a frozen landscape. The city itself was changing while the disappearances were happening. The people were changing. Technology was changing. Communications were changing. And memories were becoming older. A person trying to reconstruct events from years earlier. Memory is not a recording. It is not a video file stored perfectly inside the human brain. It changes. Details blur. Dates shift. People forget what happened before or after something else. A face that once seemed familiar becomes difficult to place. A conversation that seemed meaningless at the time may later feel important. And when investigators eventually returned to older cases connected to MacArthur, they had to work through exactly this kind of uncertainty. What happened? When did it happen? Who saw whom? Where were they? Who spoke to them last? Who might have noticed something unusual? The answers were scattered. Some were in people's memories. Some were in photographs. Some were in phones. Some were in records. And some were buried beneath years of ordinary life. But before those questions could be answered, investigators needed to understand the environment. They needed to understand the people. They needed to understand the connections. And they needed to understand why so many of the missing men had moved through the same social world. That is where church, Wellesley Village becomes central to the story. The neighborhood, they knew they could find community. And community creates networks. Friends know friends. Partners know partners. People meet through nightlife, social circles, and online connections. Someone who is new to the city may find a sense of belonging there. Someone who has lived in Toronto for decades may have spent years building relationships there. This matters because a predator does not necessarily need to search an entire city for victims. Sometimes the environment itself creates opportunities for people to encounter one another. That does not make the community responsible. It does not mean the neighborhood was inherently dangerous. It means only that proximity creates connections. And connections are precisely what investigators later needed to understand. Bruce MacArthur was familiar with this world. He was not a stranger arriving from another city with no connection to the people around him. He moved through social spaces where people could encounter one another. He had his own relationships. He knew people. He understood the environment. And he was able to appear ordinary within it. That ordinary appearance is important. Because if we imagine MacArthur as an obvious outsider, we misunderstand the case. He did not need to announce himself. He could simply exist within it. That is one of the most unsettling characteristics of many real-world predators. They do not always attack from outside. Sometimes they operate from within environments where people feel safe. They learn the routines. They learn the social expectations. They understand what behavior will appear normal. And they use that understanding to move through the world without attracting attention. MacArthur had another advantage. He was older. By the time many of the later disappearances occurred, he was not the kind of person most people would immediately imagine as a dangerous predator. He could appear settled, experienced, ordinary. There was nothing cinematic about his daily life. He had work. He had clients. He had responsibilities. He knew how to talk to people. He knew how to present himself. And that is precisely why the contrast became so disturbing once investigators began uncovering the truth. The public often expects a serial killer to live a secret life in every sense of the word. But secrecy does not always mean isolation. A person can hide terrible behavior inside a very visible. They can buy groceries. They can attend social gatherings. They can speak to neighbors. They can complain about the weather. They can talk about their plans. And then, behind closed doors, they can become someone else entirely. This division between public appearance and private behavior would become one of the central questions surrounding MacArthur. Who was the man people thought they knew? And who was the man revealed by the investigation? Those two versions could not easily coexist. Yet they had existed side by side for years. To understand how that was possible, we have to step away from the image of a criminal mastermind. MacArthur was not some fictional genius who controlled every detail of his surroundings. He made mistakes. He left evidence. He created connections. He eventually attracted suspicion. And investigators eventually found enough evidence to arrest him. But he benefited from something far more ordinary than genius. He benefited from assumptions. The assumption that a person who looked normal was probably normal. The assumption that disappearances were unrelated. The assumption that adults could leave voluntarily. The assumption that if something truly dangerous were happening, someone would handle. They are also dangerous when repeated too many times. Because every missing person case creates a choice. Investigators have to decide where to focus limited resources. They have to determine what possibilities are most likely. They have to decide which details deserve immediate attention. And those decisions are made with incomplete information. There is no perfect map. No guarantee. No way to know which detail will eventually become the key. In the early years of this story, nobody had that key. The first disappearances did not come with a label saying they were connected. The men did not disappear in a single dramatic event witnessed by dozens of people. They simply stopped being there. And when a person disappears quietly, the world can remain strangely normal. That is perhaps the most haunting image of all. A person vanishes. And the next morning, the city looks exactly the same. The sun rises. Cars move. People go to work. Someone opens a store. Someone buys coffee. Someone laughs with a friend. Someone complains about traffic. And somewhere, a family is staring at an empty chair. That contrast between ordinary life and race. It would appear again and again. A normal day. A missing person. A search. A file. A question. Then another disappearance. Another search. Another file. Years later, investigators would place those files beside one another. And only then would the similarities become impossible to ignore. But in 2010, nobody knew what 2017 would bring. In 2012, nobody knew that the investigation would eventually lead back to 2010. In 2015, nobody knew that another disappearance would eventually become part of the same pattern. And in 2016, nobody knew that the following year would bring the case into public view. The future was invisible. That is why the setting matters. The story did not happen in a vacuum. It happened in a city where millions of people were living ordinary lives. It happened in a neighborhood where people were searching for connection. It happened during a period when technology was changing how people met one another. And it happened in a society where assumptions about missing adults could sometimes delay the recognition of danger. Those factors created the environment. But they do not explain the person who committed them. That distinction matters. When we examine a case like this, There is always a temptation to search for environmental explanations. Was the neighborhood too open? Was the community too trusting? Did people ignore warning signs? Did victims take unnecessary risks? Those questions can easily become a way of shifting responsibility away from the offender. The men who disappeared were not responsible for what was done to them. They were living their lives. They were meeting people. They were going to familiar places. They were making ordinary decisions in an ordinary city. The responsibility belonged to the person who chose to exploit those circumstances. And that person was Bruce McArthur. But at this stage of the story, he was not yet the Bruce McArthur known to the public. He was simply a man moving through Toronto. A landscaper. A familiar face. A person who knew how to work with his hands. Someone who could arrive at a property and make changes that most people would never notice once the work was finished. He understood space. He understood privacy. He understood how quickly an ordinary garden could change. And he understood how easily people could become comfortable around sutters. People often trust those who provide a service. A repairman. A cleaner. A contractor. A gardener. A delivery driver. Someone whose job requires access to private spaces. The relationship begins with a transaction. But repeated contact creates familiarity. The person becomes recognizable. Eventually, the stranger is no longer a stranger. That familiarity can lower people's defenses. Again, this is not unique to McArthur. It is simply one of the ways ordinary social trust works. And McArthur lived inside that mechanism. He did not have to force himself into people's lives. He could be invited. That difference would become especially important when investigators began examining properties connected to him. The places where he had worked were not random. They were places he could legitimately enter. Places where his presence could be explained. Places where his movements might not immediately seem suspicious. This would later make the discovery of human remains in landscaping-related locations even more disturbing. Because suddenly, the profession that had once made McArthur look ordinary became part of the investigation. The plants. The gardens. The private yards. All of them acquired a new meaning. But before the investigators ever reached those gardens, there were years of uncertainty. Years when families did not know where their loved ones were. Years when some people continued hoping. Years when others began fearing the worst. And years when the city did not yet understand that it was looking at a pattern. That is where the story becomes more than a criminal investigation. It becomes a story about memory. Toronto had to remember. Police had to remember. Communities had to remember. And investigators had to go backward through time, reopening old questions that had never received satisfying answers. A disappearance from 2010 could no longer be viewed only through the lens of 2010. It had to be examined again after what was discovered in 2018. That is an extraordinary burden for investigators. Because every new fact can force you to reinterpret something you previously believed. A conversation that once seemed irrelevant becomes important. A person who once seemed peripheral becomes central. A location that once meant nothing becomes a crime scene. A name that once appeared in investigation. And a man who once seemed ordinary becomes the central figure in the story. Bruce McArthur. The name would eventually become familiar across Canada. But before that happened, the people who encountered him did not have the benefit of hindsight. They did not know his future. They could not see the pattern. They could only see what was directly in front of them. A man. A conversation. A job. A meeting. A city. And then, sometimes, an absence. That is how this story moved through Toronto. Quietly. Almost invisibly. Until 2017. Until Andrew Kinsman disappeared. Until police began asking harder questions. Until Project Prism was launched. Until investigators began looking at McArthur more closely. And until the ordinary landscape of Toronto began to look different. The streets had not changed. The buildings had not changed. But the meaning of certain places had. A familiar neighborhood could now be viewed as part of a criminal timeline. A garden could become a potential crime scene. A vehicle could become evidence. A photograph could be a timestamp. And a person's name could become the bridge between years of unanswered questions. That transformation is at the heart of the case. The city itself became a kind of archive. Its streets held memories. Its houses held records. Its people held fragments. And investigators had to collect those fragments before they disappeared completely. The process would take months. The consequences would last for years. But before the investigation reached its most intense stage, there was one thing investigators still needed to understand. The victims. Who were these men? Where did they come from? Who loved them? Who missed them? What were their lives like before their names became associated with a serial killer? Those questions would eventually lead investigators and the public away from the image of Bruce McArthur and back toward the people who had been pushed into the background by his crimes. And that is where the story must go next. Because a serial killer can take a life. He can create fear. He can dominate headlines. He can become a name people remember. But he does not own the story. The story also belongs to the people who were taken from the world. And before we enter the darkest moments of what, not as bodies, not as evidence, not as numbers, not as names on a courtroom document, but as men living in Toronto. Men with histories. Men with relationships. Men who had plans for the future. Men who expected to wake up the next morning and continue living. The city around them had no idea how their stories would end. Neither did they. And perhaps that is the most important thing to remember as we move deeper into this case. Every victim was once living in a moment that felt ordinary. A morning. An afternoon. A conversation. A meal. A walk through a familiar street. A message sent to a friend. A plan for tomorrow. None of them knew that tomorrow might never come. And somewhere in that ordinary world, Bruce McArthur was moving through the same city. Waiting. Watching. Living among everyone else. Until the lives of these men crossed his path. And once they did, their stories would never be the same again. Before the names became part of a criminal investigation, they belonged to a city. And a city is never just streets and buildings. It is memory. It is routine without thinking. The corner where someone always waits for a friend. The restaurant where a person knows exactly what they are going to order. The street someone takes because it is faster. The apartment where someone keeps their clothes, their photographs, their keys. The neighborhood where people begin to recognize faces. That was Toronto in the years before Bruce McArthur was exposed. A city large enough to disappear inside. A city small enough, in certain communities, for people to recognize one another. That contradiction mattered. Toronto offered anonymity and familiarity at the same time. For some people, anonymity was freedom. For others, community was freedom. And for many members of the LGBTQ+ community, Church Wellesley Village provided a place where those two ideas could coexist. You could arrive alone and find people. You could be surrounded by strangers and still feel understood. You could walk through the neighborhood and see signs that told you this was a place where you belonged. That sense of belonging cannot be measured in police reports. But it matters when we try to understand the emotional background of the case. Because when people disappear from a community that has been built around belonging, the loss is felt different. Two become a concern. Several become a fear. People begin comparing memories. They ask questions. They remember names. They remember faces. They begin noticing who has not been seen recently. And eventually, the absence of certain people becomes impossible to ignore. But the road to that realization was long. The disappearances were spread over years. Some men were reported missing quickly. Others were not. Some had strong networks of family and friends. Others lived more privately. Some were immigrants who had built new lives far from the places where they were born. Some had complicated personal circumstances. And some existed on the edges of a society that does not always notice people until they are gone. That is an uncomfortable truth. A person's visibility in life can affect how quickly their absence is recognized. The more isolated someone is, the fewer people may immediately ask where they went. That does not make the disappearance less important. It only means that the alarm may sound later. In the MacArthur case, this difference would matter. Because one of the 8 men connected to him, Kirushna Kumar Kanagaratnam, was not reported missing when he disappeared the investigation. By then, years had passed. The gap between disappearance and recognition became part of the tragedy. A person can disappear from a city without disappearing from the memories of those who knew them. But if nobody knows where to look, those memories can remain scattered. A photograph here. A name there. An old conversation. A social media account that stops updating. A phone number that never answers. A room that remains untouched. This is what investigators were eventually forced to reconstruct. Not simply crimes. Lives. And that reconstruction began with place. Where did these men live? Where did they work? Where did they socialize? Who did they know? Where did they meet MacArthur? What routes did they take? Where were they last seen? What locations connected the different cases? The answers created a network. And at the center of that network was Toronto. But Toronto itself was changing. The city in 2010 was not exactly the same city in 2017. Technology had changed. Social habits had changed. The way people met had changed. The way people communicate powerful. Digital records had become more detailed. Social media had become deeply integrated into everyday life. Messages could create timestamps. Photos could reveal locations. Online activity could establish relationships. And in a modern investigation, a person's digital life can become almost as important as their physical movements. That would become crucial in the MacArthur investigation. But technology was not the only thing changing. The way people thought about missing adults was also being challenged. There was an old assumption that adults could simply leave. Maybe someone wanted a new life. Maybe they had relationship problems. Maybe they had financial problems. Maybe they were struggling with addiction. Maybe they had chosen not to contact anyone. Sometimes those explanations are true. But they can also become dangerous when they are accepted too quickly. A missing person may not be missing because they chose to disappear. They may be missing because someone made that choice for them. The difference can cost time. And in a homicide investigation, time matters. Every hour matters. Every day matters. Every piece of evidence that remains untouched matters. The longer investigators wait, the more difficult the reconstruction becomes. That is why the eventual discovery of a serial killer operating over several years raised such difficult questions. Could earlier cases have been connected? Could the pattern have been recognized? Could some of the missing men have been found sooner? Those questions cannot be answered with certainty simply by looking backward. But they became unavoidable after MacArthur's arrest. And the neighborhood itself became part of the conversation. Church Wellesley Village had long been a visible center of LGBTQ+ life in Toronto. Its streets carried generations of stories. Celebrations. Protests. Relationships. Losses. Political struggles. Personal victories. For many people, it represented the ability to live more openly. That history made the disappearances especially painful. Because fear can change the meaning of a familiar place. A street that once felt welcoming can suddenly feel exposed. A bar can become a place where people look over their shoulder. A meeting with a stranger can become something people reconsider. A familiar face can become unfamiliar. Trust can be isolation. But there is another danger. When a community is frightened, people may begin searching for explanations that are too simple. They may suspect entire groups. They may blame victims. They may assume that anyone who behaves differently must be dangerous. Fear can create its own distortions. That is why the responsibility in this case must remain clearly placed. The men who disappeared were not responsible for what happened to them. Their relationships did not cause their deaths. Their identities did not cause their deaths. Their social lives did not cause their deaths. Their decisions to meet people did not cause their deaths. The responsibility belonged to the person who chose to exploit those circumstances. Bruce McArthur. That distinction becomes especially important when examining the psychological dynamics of the case. McArthur's ability to operate for years depended partly on his capacity to appear acceptable. He did not need everyone to love him. He only needed enough people to see him as ordinary. That is a much lower barrier. A person does not have to be charismatic to appear harmless. They simply need to avoid attracting the kind of attention that triggers suspicion. And McArthur appears to have understood. He worked. He interacted with people. He remained part of the surrounding social world. His profession gave him a reason to move through residential spaces. His age could make him appear less threatening. His familiarity with certain communities gave him opportunities to meet people. None of these facts alone explains the murders. But together, they created an environment in which he could move without immediately standing out. That is one of the most frightening lessons of the case. Predators do not necessarily survive because they are invisible. Sometimes they survive because they look familiar. Familiarity lowers attention. A stranger receives scrutiny. A familiar person often does not. The same person who might make us uncomfortable when encountered alone can seem completely harmless when introduced through someone we know. Trust travels through social networks. So does danger. And when a predator becomes part of a social environment, the community may unknowingly help him appear more ordinary. Again, the community is not to blame. The predator is. But understanding how trust operates is essential to understanding how someone can remain hidden. McArthur's life also contained warning signs. In 2001, he had attacked a man with a metal pipe. In 2003, he pleaded guilty to assault causing bodily harm. Later, in 2016, police investigated an allegation of sexual assault involving him, although he was not charged in that case. Those facts became deeply important after the murders were uncovered. Because once people know the ending, earlier events seem different. A prior assault is no longer just a prior assault. A police investigation from years later is no longer just an isolated incident. People begin asking whether these were warning signs. Whether someone should have connected them. Whether the system had enough information to see the danger. And those questions would eventually become part of the broader examination of the Toronto police response. But in the middle of the events themselves, those connections were not obvious. The future was not available to the people making decisions in the past. That is something worth remembering. It is easy to say, they should have known. It is harder to ask what they actually knew at the time. Investigations are built from information. If information is missing, the picture is incomplete. If information is held in separate places, the pattern may remain invisible. Nobody may understand the whole. The McArthur case would expose the consequences of that fragmentation. 8 men. Multiple years. Multiple investigations. Multiple stories. And eventually, one offender. The city had unknowingly created the perfect environment for the pattern to remain fragmented. Not because Toronto was uniquely careless. But because large cities are complicated. People move. Records are scattered. Communities overlap. Police units specialize. Cases are assigned individually. And every missing person initially appears to be a single problem. The question is whether anyone can recognize when separate problems are actually one problem. That is what Project Prism eventually became. An attempt to see the larger picture. And once investigators began seeing it, they could not look away. By late 2017, the possibility that McArthur was connected to multiple disappearances was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. The surveillance became more focused. Investigators began gathering evidence with the knowledge that they might be dealing with something much larger than one homicide. They had to move carefully. A premature arrest, if MacArthur realized the extent of the investigation, he might change his behavior. Evidence could disappear. People could be warned. The investigation could collapse. So police watched. They waited. They collected. And while they did, MacArthur continued living in Toronto. That period of surveillance is one of the most psychologically tense moments in the entire case. The investigators knew they were watching a man they suspected of terrible crimes. But they still needed proof. Suspicion is not enough. A theory is not enough. A name is not enough. The case had to be built. Piece by piece. And eventually, it was. January 2018 arrived. The investigation had reached the point where police believed they had enough evidence to act. On January 18th, Bruce MacArthur was arrested. The arrest changed everything. Until that moment, the public had been living with rumors, fears, and unanswered questions. After the arrest, the investigation moved into a new phase. The police could now search. They could examine properties connected to MacArthur. They could seize evidence. They could begin reconstructing the suspected escape of Toronto began revealing a darker history. Investigators discovered human remains. The search expanded. More remains were found. More names emerged. The number of potential victims increased. And each new discovery forced investigators to go further backward. The first 2 murder charges became 3. Then 4. Then 5. The investigation widened. And eventually, the number reached 8. 8 men. 8 families. 8 stories. At that point, the city could no longer treat the disappearances as isolated events. The pattern had a name. The name was Bruce MacArthur. But even then, the story was not complete. Knowing who was responsible does not tell you everything about the people who were lost. It does not explain what they dreamed about. What they worried about. Who they called when they were happy. Who they called when they were afraid. What music they liked. What food they preferred. What made them laugh. What they hoped would happen next. Those details may not appear in a police timeline. But they are the details that make a person real. And true crime has a responsibility too heavily on the offender is that the killer becomes the protagonist. The victims become supporting characters. The criminal gets a face. The victims become photographs. That is backwards. The victims were the people. The offender was the interruption. Their lives existed before him. Their families existed before him. Their memories existed before him. And those memories will continue long after his name has faded from public attention. So as we leave the setting behind, we are going to move closer to those lives. We are going to step away from the broad streets of Toronto. Away from the skyline. Away from the police investigation. Away from the image of the serial killer. And we are going to look at the men themselves. The first one. Then the next. Not because their deaths make them interesting, but because their lives made them human. We will meet them before the disappearance. Before the headlines. Before the photographs on television. Before the police files. Before the word victim was attached to their names. Skandara Navaratnam was not born into a story about Bruce MacArthur. Neither was Abdulbasir Faizi. Neither was Mojid Kayhan. Neither was Dean Lizowick. Neither was Salim Eason. Neither was Andrew Kinsman. Neither was Karushna Kumar Kanagaratnam. They were living separate lives. Until one man crossed through them. And that is the tragedy at the center of this case. A killer may imagine that he controls the story because he controls what happens to his victims. But he does not control what remains. Names remain. Photographs remain. Memories remain. Families remain. And questions remain. Why them? Why then? Why was nobody able to see the pattern sooner? And how could a man who lived in plain sight continue for so many years? Those questions will follow us through every stage of the story. But before we try to answer them, we have to slow down again. Because the next part is not about Bruce MacArthur. It is about the people who disappeared. It is about the lives they had built before anyone knew they were in danger. It is about the families who waited for them. It is about the friends who remembered the last time they saw them. And it is about the moment when an ordinary life became an unanswered question. The city is still there. The streets are still there. The neighborhood is still is. People still meet. People still laugh. People still fall in love. Life continues. But for the families connected to these 8 men, there will always be a before and an after. Before the disappearance. And after. Before the name Bruce MacArthur entered their lives. And after. That dividing line cannot be erased. The only thing that can be done is to remember what existed before it. To remember the men as they were. To remember that they were not born as victims. They became victims of another person's choices. And that is where the story now turns. Away from the killer. Toward the lives. Toward the faces. Toward the people who once walked through Toronto believing they had another tomorrow waiting for them. Because the most important part of this story is not how a serial killer hid. It is who was left behind when he was finally found. And before we reach the evidence, the arrest, the courtroom, and the sentence, we need to understand what was lost. 8 men. 8 lives. 1 city. And a silence that lasted far too long.